I have a million questions that I'm asked all the time about being an entrepreneur. What's it like, and is it scary being an entrepreneur, and how did you get started? And there's a million questions people want to ask you. And I thought to myself, bang, one day, wouldn't it be great to have an entrepreneur's masterclass where I can bring some of these unbelievable people, people like we read about them and we read their stories. They're legendary, but we only see them on film and we have visualization of what they are. But actually to sit down with them and talk to them, I thought, wouldn't that be a wonderful way to learn? Nothing's new. I remember watching the old actor classes several years ago, how they visualized and how they created their careers and how they just kept getting better and better. And I thought to myself at that time, what a wonderful way for a young person to learn the craft directly from the old guys. I thought it was a very elegant way to teach. Usually I let Dr. Tim formally introduce our guests, and you'll see Warren's bio on the screen. But in this case, there's so much to tell you about Warren. I want to tell you about some of the neat and the fun things that this man has accomplished in his life. Warren is living a life continually reaching for the stars, and he's managed actually to grab quite a few. And I predict Warren is just getting started, and he's also having a lot of fun along the way. The common thread that goes through Warren's experience is vision, strategy, executive leadership, and achievement. Warren's created, led, and grown so many successful private and public and not-for-profit companies. He's got philanthropy has always been one of his goals, and he's got a passion for family, entrepreneurship, public policy, and community. He's always, I'd say, Warren has a serving heart. That's the best way to put him. Now, in his formal business background, which you'll be interested in, is he was CEO of Providence Service Corporation, now a NASDAQ $2.1 billion social services and healthcare company. Warren was also chairman and CEO of Rural Metro Corp, which is a $500 million NASDAQ-listed emergency services company. That's kind of the formal stuff. And I could go on with many more companies he served. But here's some of the fun things he had time for. Can you imagine this job? He was special assistant when he was younger to Vice President of the United States. Can you imagine this? He was an appointment secretary to the President of the United States. There must be so many stories in that. As the years have moved on, Warren took many positions, not paid positions, just for the benefit, again, with his serving heart. I served in an organization called WPO, where Warren was the global chair. That's an organization of 10,000 CEOs in over 100 countries. That's just some of the things, but here's some more fun things. Warren was elected to the Sports Hall of Fame. He was an All-American academic basketball player and a member of the USA basketball team at the World Basketball Championships. He was actually drafted by the Golden State Warriors. I think that's enough about Warren. We got to meet this man. And to conduct the interview, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Tim Schulte, who's going to tell a bit more about Warren and ask him some very stimulating questions so that Warren can share his secrets of entrepreneurial success with us today. Tim, thanks for facilitating. I'm just going to sit back now and I'm going to hand Warren over to you, and I'm going to listen and I'm going to learn.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I appreciate it. And, Warren, with that kind of background, how do you think about success? How would you define success?
Well, Tim, thank you for having me on the show. And I think we ought to be curious about Peter, because I want to invite him to do my eulogy. It was a phenomenal introduction. I'm a little concerned that he went over the top. So maybe I'll get a chance to correct some of that hyperbole when I get further into this. I created a quote years ago that has stood the test of time, I think, and that is, success is relevant only when measured against one's own potential. I think we think too often of success as the world would measure success. Success for me really is, what's my potential, and have I reached near or at my potential? And that's success in whatever I might do, whether it's playing basketball or it's running a company or it's being a father and a husband. How close to my potential am I operating? If I'm operating close to my potential, that defines success for me. So success is relevant only when measured against one's own potential.
What were some of those pivotal moments, or what were some of those early year activities that really, as you look back on it, enabled some of the success that we can talk about today?
Well, I was born on an isolated farm in Minnesota. We were 4 miles from nowhere, and we were just stuck out there by ourselves. And my father was my best mentor. And he even as a young boy, 4, 5, 6 years old, sitting on his lap on a John Deere tractor, would recite poetry to me, talk to me about the opera, about Broadway plays, about places he had traveled during the war, about all those things, right? So he was seeding my mind for success, even though I didn't realize that until 15 or 20 years later. I would look back on those times and he would have put in my mind the things that I would be experiencing in my own future. About 12 years old, we moved to Southern California and I discovered surfing and the beach and all that fun stuff. Somebody handed me a basketball when I was about 14 and said, maybe if you dribble this, things will happen. By the time I graduated from high school, there were multiple universities asking me to play for them. I ended up at the University of Arizona because I like blue sky and sunshine, and they had a great coach and a great recruiting class. And so I had a good experience there. So what I learned from sports were the key ingredients to being success as an entrepreneur. It was about discipline, dedication, commitment, effort, right? Diligence, all those kinds of things that to be a good athlete, you have to apply to be successful. I found those same ingredients had to be applied to be a successful entrepreneur. And as I went further, whether it was working in the White House, being a White House fellow, leading different companies, those same attributes had to be plentiful for me to be successful. And so I think most of us as entrepreneurs know and understand what we need to do to be successful, but only the successful ones really apply the formula consistently.
As you think about that growth and that scale, you often need to bring in other individuals, and your application often shifts from individual contributor level things you can do, dribbling the basketball, to coordinating the activities of multiple people. Can you talk a little bit about that journey and making that transition to individual success and being great at what you do, to really helping enable teams to be great so you can accomplish that much more?
Well, I think all of us would agree that the people around us make us successful, and the better the talent around us, the better we are. I never want to be the smartest person in the room. If I'm the smartest guy in the room, we're all in trouble, right? So I think it's really important that we hire great people and have great people and allow them to experience failure and success. Our job is to guide them, to assist them, to help them. I've always said that the entrepreneur has to grow at the same rate of complexity as the organization they're leading. In fact, I would suggest that we need to grow slightly faster to stay ahead of the curve. So this constant learning, this acquisition of knowledge becomes terrifically important for entrepreneurs, because if we stay in a static state, if we don't move forward, then our organization ultimately will stagnate, I believe, regardless of the good people we have around us. And I think that as we move up in complexity, I know my first organization that I led was a few $1 million in revenue. And then they grew after that, right, until they became billions of dollars of revenue. And I had to continuously grow and learn during that period of time, or I would have been left behind. And I think there's some natural breakpoints. I think the entrepreneur can lead an organization to about 50 or $60 million. And then oftentimes we need to find someone else in our experience. And then that next entrepreneur can lead it to 250 to $500 million. And then the complexity gets too great and we may need somebody else. And then at $1 billion, there's probably another breakpoint. So the complexity of the organization continues to grow. And that leader must also match that pace, or difficult things happen in the environment. And I've seen lots of companies that have failed to take advantage of great growth opportunities because the leader was not growing. And so I hope that answers your question, this notion that constantly learning, acquiring new skills, new abilities, new capacities is essential for the leader, and then having really good people around us and managing those teams in a highly collaborative, consensual process to get the best out of them, to create incentives for them to be successful. And when they fail, see that only as a part of a business cycle, that we all are going to fail at different times. And creating the opportunity for somebody to fail is really very, very important.
You talked about the need for that, and it's obviously important. No doubt early in your life, as you talked about your father serving as a mentor and helping you learn and really establish what you're going to be experiencing later in life. As an entrepreneur and someone moving up in organizations and taking on more and more complexity and growing organizations, what did you find most helpful in learning? Was it other mentors along the way, or what are some of the tools that you use to continually gather insights and information and grow and outpace the growth of the complexity of the organizations that you led?
There are several answers to your question. The first is there's just the acquisition of knowledge, right? We need to be readers. We need to be thinking about these. We need to take time and pause in our busy careers to actually think and get clarity about where we're going. I think the baseline for me as in any great leader, what I've experienced in observing others is they have clarity of vision. That even when things are murky and vague, the really great leader somehow finds the vision necessary to move forward. So that's a clarity of vision is a particularly critical and foundational element. So the acquisition of knowledge, always growing, always learning. Secondly, we need to see people in our environment who are role models for the kind of behavior and leader that we want to be. Sometimes they're formal mentors. Peter mentioned that he'd had mentors his entire life. My father was a mentor to me. And sometimes we have to have those mentors. I've always found in sports, as a young entrepreneur, in the community, and certainly at the White House and beyond, people that I looked to that were actually modeling the behavior and the knowledge and the position that I wanted to have at some point in my life. And so I always had a way of growing through them to learn more. So I think that's an important part of how we see things. They could be a formal mentor or they may not be, but they are modeling the behaviors, the value set, right? The intentionality that we want to have in the kinds of things that we do.
I would imagine that, especially in the White House, there's a lot of give and take, a lot of negotiation that's probably taking place, and a lot of juggling of simultaneous activities because of some of the complexity. Would you mind sharing a bit about what you learned at that time in the White House relative to maybe like what would be the most pivotal point or most compelling story that you remember? It's like, wow, I learned so much during this piece of work and has really stuck with me through the years. Is there something that stands out to you?
Well, there are so many highlights during that period of time because when you work in the White House, the adrenaline flows every day. You recognize you're working on only big issues because only the big issues come to the White House, to the executive branches of the president, right? The small issues are taken care of in other places in the bureaucracy and by other people. And so everything that's really of significance come to the president's desk, and the president has to make judgments about that. So watching an executive leader, if you will, in the president of the United States, lead the executive branch at the highest level of government, arguably the most powerful position in the world, and watch the way in which he deliberated, the way in which he sought information, the people with whom he surrounded himself, the process by which we went about doing things in the White House was a phenomenal experience for me. I was only 29 years old when I went to the White House. I got there through a nationally competitive process called the White House Fellows Program. So I was one of 17 fellows selected that year. And our jobs were to become close to the president, the vice president, the cabinet secretary. So each of us had individual responsibilities and so forth. So it was an extraordinary time for me as a young man. And I would suggest that all the good things that happened in my life following the White House were a result of the experience I had there. I might give you a couple of stories that are kind of interesting. The first of which was we had 4 people that played tennis on the White House tennis court whenever we could. And one was Dean Birch, who was the head of the Republican National Committee. One was the President of the United States. And one was George H.W. Bush, who happened to be my tennis partner and went on to have a fairly nice career himself. But at the time, he was head of the CIA. We were playing tennis one day on the court, and Dean Birch hit a short lob. I was at the net on one side. The President of the United States was at the net on the other side. I took a couple of steps back, and as a young athlete, I was, of course, going to crush the ball and impress my opponents and put the tennis ball away. But it came off my angle, my racket at kind of a strange angle. It hit the President of the United States right in the diaphragm. And he went down like a bull moose shot with a 30-06, boom, right on his face. We all rushed over, Secret Service rushed over. And when we got there, we could discern no vital signs. No, he wasn't breathing. I mean, so now my first realization, I've killed the president with a tennis ball. This is not a good feeling. My second realization is that I'm now unemployed. So soon the president started coughing and spitting and wheezing, and we helped him up. He grabbed the nearest Secret Service agent, pointed at me and said, "Kill him." Well, I learned a very important lesson during that period of time, right? The first is don't hit the president with a tennis ball. And the second is get out of gunshot range. So it was a really interesting experience, a different kind of experience. It became obvious to me. I was 29 years old. I was a farm kid. I didn't know what I was doing when I got to the White House. I was responsible for all the president's scheduling. I was the cabinet secretary. I was doing a bunch of stuff and didn't know what I was doing. I was afraid I was going to embarrass or humiliate the president with a mistake that I made, because nothing really stays private in the White House. It all becomes public at some point in time. So I knew I had to resign. And so after we had a meeting of the key people, and if you think about the key advisors to the president, it was Henry Kissinger, Brent Scowcroft, Don Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, George H.W. Bush. There were some pretty interesting people. And so we had a meeting in the Oval Office, and I waited around afterwards to let the others filter out. And I said, Mr. President, may I meet with you? And he said, yes, please sit down. So I repeated, Mr. President, I'm not smart enough. I'm not experienced enough. I'm probably going to make a mistake that'll humiliate you. And I need to tender my resignation. And here's my letter of resignation. He swiveled his chair around and looked out across the south lawn of the White House. And for what seemed like 6 or 8 hours, it was probably 10 seconds or so, I was a little anxious to hear his response. And when he turned around, he said, Warren, the very fact that you've told me this qualifies you to be here. And what he said as a leader was that if you're vulnerable, transparent, and honest, then I can trust you. And from that point on, he trusted me with information and things that I did for him that no 29-year-old farm kid should have had the chance to do. I learned a critical piece of leadership at that moment in time, that if I could continue to be vulnerable, transparent, and honest, that I could meet the expectations of others, and I could encourage other leaders to be the same way. That has really helped me over the time that I've been a CEO and a leader of organizations, to admit that I don't know, to admit I'm not the smartest one in the room, to acknowledge that other people's ideas are also very good and very helpful, to acknowledge in mentorship that I receive what you've told me and I will act on what you've told me. So a bit of a long explanation, but I hope that's helpful as we think about answering your question.
Yeah, Warren, I've got a couple of kind of in-depth questions for you. And this is for the entrepreneurs out there, who are listening to what we're talking about here and watching you transition through this very varied career you've had, because you've touched on various areas in your life that some people, most people, one of them is their whole life, but you've touched all these different aspects. So what I was wondering, and I'll call it your playbook, Warren, I'll call it the Warren Rustand playbook, as I have interviewed a few very successful entrepreneurs this last while and over my life, they all have their own playbook. So I ask you, in that playbook, you can sort of take that playbook and give it to Bill and say, here's my playbook, Bill. You do this, 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 and this, and you're going to achieve that. What can we tell and what can we pass on to these entrepreneurs listening to guide people to play by the playbook, to develop their own playbook and follow these rules that you just stated so eloquently? Because they see it, we get taught by everybody, but a lot of times they don't take it home. How can we make it stick better?
Great question, Peter. And I'm sorry for this, but in about 90 days, I'm publishing a book that has the playbook in it, right? It has all the principles. So here are the principles. Here's what I would tell Bill. Here's what I would tell any entrepreneur, and I've been telling for years. First, clarity of vision. I touched on that earlier. That's really the definition of our purpose. Where are we going with our lives? That's the overriding issue. The second is acting with intent. It's the certainty of intentionality. Okay. So once we know where we're going, then we need to act on that every day. The third is the power of values. It's the notion that how we live our lives and how we model our life is really important, because people watch us as CEOs and entrepreneurs. They look to us for guidance and direction. We have to live the values that we say are important to us, right? So that's really important. And then there are 5 applications to those 3. The first, commit to a higher level of discipline than you've ever had in your life. However you've been disciplined, do it more often. The second, live with purpose every day. Figure out your purpose every morning about what's important for that day, and then live to that purpose every day. The next is act with intent on everything we have on our schedule. Everything we're doing each day should be intentional, not unintentional, not getting swept along by trends, not by doing what's fashionable, but by doing what you need to do. The next is make conscious choices. Don't unconsciously go through life. Look at everything as a conscious choice and then make a firm decision about that choice. And the last is engage in a cause greater than yourself. We are great givers. Peter, you and Rita have shown us how to be philanthropic, how to be great givers in life, how to serve others. The notion of servant leadership is embodied in your lives. That is really important for us. We have a broader, bigger community to serve. Making money is interesting, but making money is a way to benefit others. It's a way to help others along on the journey. And I like a quote that says, we're all just walking each other back home. We're all just helping each other down the road. And the better we can do that, and there's no more evidence of that than right now in the United States, where we have civil unrest, where we have protesters against discrimination, that we have to appreciate that we're all equal, that we all need equal access in this world to the same things, and that you and I and others have to step up in our role as leaders in the broader community to demonstrate the very values and beliefs that we have. So that's my playbook. It's those 8 principles. And I live by those every day. I try, I fail, I get up, I dust myself off, I go back and do it again. And you know how that works, Peter. We try a lot of stuff and hopefully that we're successful in the end. So success for me is about my life purpose, which is to improve the human condition wherever I find it. So wherever I find the human condition in bad shape, I apply whatever resources I have to benefit that situation.
Warren, I want to stay on this success bit for a while, because that was fantastic, and I want to capture that. The definition I had for success one time was the attainment of a predetermined goal. It was kind of simple. It doesn't matter what it is, but if you want something and you get it, that's success. Once I was asked more, and I said, they asked me about success, what I thought of it. And I said, well, my success really is my ability to attract, retain, and motivate people better than me. And you kind of said the same thing a little bit earlier. So I want to ask you, Warren, you've done that all the time. We do that. And you got this playbook, you're out there, but can you think of a set of rules to attract, retain, and motivate people better than you? What makes them come? How can the entrepreneurs learn from you how they can put a team around them who are excited, motivated, and want to be part of what you're doing?
Well, first, it's how we live our lives, right? It's just how we live our lives. It's the energy with which we live our lives. It's the fun that we find in living. It's the excitement and joy of what we're doing. People are attracted to that. We attract people who want to be like us. We don't attract people who are different than us. People who want to be like us, well, then we need to live the life that is important to attract the very best people. Because criminals tend to attract criminals, right? Great people tend to attract great people. I had the opportunity a few years ago, you mentioned the World Presidents Organization, and my wife and I led a university to India. And we took 800 members of WPO, the World Presidents Organization, to India for a learning experience for a week. And it was fantastic. Just before we left, we'd had the occasion to sell one of our companies. I was feeling pretty good, a little bit proud. Maybe my ego was working too hard, right? And I was not as humble as I should be. And so I was kind of hoping that we'd get back and I could spend that money that I had made, right? Maybe buy a boat or a car, or do something crazy. And so as we got ready to pack and go home, my wife said, well, we're not going home. And I said, what do you mean? My wife is always right. And my wife said, we're going to work for Mother Teresa's charities for the next 2 weeks. I said, well, that's not kind of what I had in mind. And she says, that's where we're going. So we worked for a week in the Center for Dying Patients. And then we worked for a center for the adoptive needs of special needs kids for a week. And after holding people who were in their last minutes and hours of life and talking with them, and then going to a warehouse with 5,000 cribs in it with children that had missing legs and arms and eyes who would never be adopted in the Indian system, I can tell you that that gave me a perspective that was different. And my wife was teaching me that I needed to humble myself and stop thinking about worldly success and start thinking about human need. And when she did that, she assisted me in gaining a paradigm and a perspective that helped me. That's why I say that our success is to benefit the needs of others. And when we adopt that, we're really good. We attract the best people by the values that we show and the way in which we live our life. People will be attracted to us to live that same kind of life. That happens to be my view.
Can you talk a little bit about maybe what you learned while you were, engaged in those 2 weeks, understanding how that might play into how you think about your leadership teams within organizations and teams, and how that giving mindset and that greater perspective of understanding need can actually benefit running the business?
Yeah, and I'll try to do that best I can, Tim. I think there are 4 buckets that our life falls into: family, business, community, and self. Almost everything we do, I think, fits one of those 4 buckets. And so as I analyze my time as an entrepreneur, I want to be certain that I'm exercising my life in each of those 4 buckets daily. Not weekly, not monthly, maybe not when I can, not when I have time. But on a regular basis, I have the discipline to say, number one, family's first in my life and will always be first in my life. I was once asked, if you could do one thing differently in your life, what would it be? And I said, I would marry my wife earlier. My wife, we've been married 56 years. She's been the single best mentor, coach, and companion and partner and friend that I could ever imagine. She's an extraordinary woman, and she's provided leadership in our family, which is so successful and so renowned. So I think we have to appreciate that family is a critical component to everything that we do. Second is business, right? And that's the notion of being an entrepreneur. Being an entrepreneur is hard. It takes a lot of discipline. It's tough. We've done startups. We built the largest LASIK eye surgery company in the world from scratch. And it's hard work. But even in that hard work, in that challenging time, in the demand of hours and effort that has to go into that, I can't recall that I forgot that family was first. We still have to maintain that engagement, that involvement, because it brings us the balance that we need to continue our work. And as we work hard as entrepreneurs, building these companies, working so hard, and it takes 6, 8, 10, 12 hours a day to do that, we can't forget that we're part of a larger community, the third bucket. And that even as we're building these companies, if we'll engage with our community, we will be receiving something back from that. And that community will support us as we build this company. And that's really important as well. And that even if we can afford only do a little in the community, I'm not talking about money, but giving some time, giving energy, giving talent, which is more important than money, we can help our community. And when we help our communities help us back. And then lastly, we can never forget that while we put ourselves forth, that unless we take really good care of ourselves through discipline of exercise, nutrition, and sleep, we aren't going to make it as entrepreneurs. We're just not going to make it. That the best entrepreneurs I know are those that are really good to themselves and discipline themselves to be exceptional. I have a morning routine. There was a list recently published, maybe you saw it, of the 14 ridiculously successful things that people do to make them successful. Well, one of the 14 is to have a disciplined morning routine. That the most successful people I know, when they get up in the morning, they do things in a very particular way. For me, it's a ritual called 10, 10, and 10, but it's different for everyone. So if we're just getting up and turning on the TV, reading a newspaper, grabbing our cell phone, going to the restroom, walking the dog, none of those things prepare you for success for the day. So what is it I could do first thing in the morning in a disciplined way that's going to allow me to be successful as an entrepreneur? Knowing that is critically important. Why? Well, because successful entrepreneurs do those things. So I think there are buckets in which we operate. I think we've got to be balanced in those buckets. I don't think it's one or the other. I think life is an integrated, holistic approach. We have to create the rhythm and pace for our individual lives. And each of us is different in that respect. But as we create that rhythm and pace, we become much more successful entrepreneurs.
Relative to your routine, would you mind sharing your 10-10-10 morning routine with us?
Not at all. I mean, I've been coaching and teaching it for 40 years. We've got tens of thousands of people doing it. But so when you first wake up in the morning, you first know you're awake, your eyes are open. Rather than getting out of bed, swing your legs over the edge of the bed and sit on the edge of the bed for a minute and ask yourself, why am I alive today? Why has my life been preserved for this moment? Right? Meaning, what's my purpose for the day? The real question you're asking is, what's my purpose for the day? Well, some days we have to be a great negotiator. Some days we have to be a great husband or father. Some days we've got to be a great team leader. And there are days when we have to do 2 or 3 of those things in the same day. So focus on what's most important. Stephen Covey, in his book, 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, creates a quadrant in which he differentiates between what's important versus what's urgent. If we're always doing what's urgent, we will never get to the important. You must move the urgent off your plate to get to the important. If you're always working on important things, you will always be successful. There's just no way to be stopped. So this notion of first thing in the morning, why am I alive today? What's my purpose today? That's 1 minute. Then take 10 minutes of gratefulness. We know that grateful hearts, an attitude of gratitude, makes us better, right? It just makes us better. All the research shows that it makes us happier, it makes us better, it makes us more joyful, makes us more positive. So be grateful for what we have and where we are. And the second thing then is to read something for 10 minutes that's inspirational. I'm reading right now the 100 greatest speeches ever given. It's Mother Teresa, Mandela, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, right? It's the great thinkers and leaders of our time. And every one of their speeches is powerful, right? So that inspires me. But there are other things, Chicken Soup for the Soul, a book called Thank You, The Treasure Chest, and so forth. And then the last 10 minutes, journal. Keep a journal every day, but only journal what's positive from the day before. What did I learn from the day before, positive and constructive, that I can put in my journal as a lesson that will help me in the future? And when I'm gone, that my children will read and my grandchildren will read, that will be positive and helpful to them as well. Because it's genealogically important, historically important for our families. I have my journal right here in front of me. I was, just before we came on, I was writing about yesterday and the lessons I learned about yesterday. So that's my 10, 10, and 10. A minute on the edge of the bed, 10 minutes of gratefulness, 10 minutes of inspiration, and 10 minutes of journaling. And I believe that puts your mind, after those 31 minutes, your mind is in a place that is overwhelmingly positive. And then the next thing you do when you're really positive, you go work out really hard. You need 150 minutes of exercise every day. Every week. So about 3 or 4 times a week, 30 minutes of rigorous exercise. And then the last thing you do, of course, is you put the good nutrition in your body within an hour of working out. You need protein. You got to get that in your body. And then after that, it's about how good are you at scheduling and managing time. And that's a critical piece of success as well. So long answer. Hope it's helpful.
And Warren, the word persistence came along just a while back. You mentioned the word persistence. And I think the audience would be interested to know the demonstration of your persistence, maybe when you met your wife.
My wife rolls her eyes every time I tell this story, but so I was a freshman at the University of Arizona, and I was this really good-looking, chiseled out of granite basketball player. You know, I thought I was the coolest thing in the world. And the third day I was at the University of Arizona, I was introduced to this beautiful young co-ed, smart, funny, witty, attractive. I mean, she was just spectacular. And of course, being this really good-looking guy, right, I decided to ask her out. And so I asked her out, and she said no. And I couldn't believe it. I was stunned. And so I asked her out the next week, and she said no again. I asked her out the third week. She said no again. And the fourth and the fifth. I asked her out 53 consecutive weeks, and she said no every week. Well, I was just beside myself. I wanted to go out with this girl. I thought she was really cool. So I found out that the guy she was dating was going out of town for his parents' wedding anniversary the 54th weekend. And so I went up to her and I said, I've asked you out 53 times. I'm persistent. I'm determined. I think you're special. I really want you to go out with me. Will you go out with me? And of course, she said no for the 54th time. I was crushed. And so I thought, well, I'll just be stupid. I started singing and dancing and getting on my knees and begging and doing all the stupid stuff that guys do sometimes. And finally, she was laughing and she said, okay, I'll have dinner with you. By 10:30 that night, we had determined that we never needed to see anyone else again. We were married 2 years later. We now have 7 children and 19 grandchildren. All 3 generations of us live together on the same 60 acres in the middle of the city in Tucson, Arizona. And I can tell you, I've had the happiest life ever. I can't imagine that I could have been happier. And it was totally a result of marrying the right woman. You know, we talk about being entrepreneurs. We talk about a lot of stuff. Peter, you know this to be true. In the end, the most important decision we make is who we marry and choose to spend our life with. I just got lucky and got it right. It took her a year to figure that out. I knew the first day I met her, but it took her a year to get to the same place. But I am so lucky. She's a phenomenal woman.
You are lucky, Warren. You are lucky for many, many reasons. Another story I'd like you to share is the story of the homeless man, if you don't mind.
Yeah, you know, we all run into these circumstances where people have needs and we have the ability to show an interest. And every morning when I get done working out, I go to the same Circle K convenience store and get the same Gatorade, and I guzzle my Gatorade and head on home to take a shower. One morning I went into the store and I noticed as I came out, there was a young man with a white shirt and blue jeans and everything he owned in a bag and long blonde hair, and he was just sitting there. And so I went in, got another Gatorade, and I came out and offered him the Gatorade, and he refused. He didn't say anything to me. He just waved me off. Every day for the next many weeks that I went in to get my Gatorade, he was still there, and he was sitting there 14, 15 hours a day. And so I'd bring him something, and I'd offer him food and so forth, but it was never. He finally brought himself to say, no, thank you, but that was about the most we ever interchanged. One day I handed him my cell phone. I said, do you have somebody you'd like to call? And he said a really sad thing to me. He said, I have no one to call. That's a very sad place to be for a human being. And so I kept going back there. And then one day he wasn't there. He was gone. And I asked the clerks inside, where did he go? And they said, well, we don't know. There was a woman who came in and showed interest in him, and they seemed to have a good time, and they conversed. And as the weather got colder, she gave him a sleeping bag, a Sub-Zero sleeping bag, and she gave him a bag to carry his possessions, brought him some warmer clothes because he lived under a bridge about 150 yards from that Circle K convenience store. And then the clerk said there was a younger man who came in and showed an interest in him, and they got to talking, and they talked every day. And then finally one day they got in this young man's car and drove away, and we haven't seen him since. And I was just always curious about what happened to him, but I continued going back to the Circle K. And one day I went to the Circle K, reached in for my Gatorade, and there was movement to my left. And so it caught my attention. I looked to my left, and there were those piercing blue eyes that I had seen on that young man outside all those many weeks. But he looked different. He was in a three-piece suit, a white shirt, a tie, wingtip shoes. Hair was cut, looked great. And I said, I think I know you. And he said, I wasn't very nice to you. And I said, oh, that's not the issue. I said, I'm interested in stories. Tell me your story. You look great. And he said, well, I didn't really react to you, but there was a middle-aged woman who came in, and she was really kind, and she reminded me of my mother, and we got to talking, and she brought me a sleeping bag and some new clothes and helped me through the winter, and she was just really kind. And then a young man came in, had kind of curly hair, and he was my age, and we started talking, and we just hit it off. I trusted him, and I liked him. And one day he said to me, I think I know some people who can help you if you're interested. And he said, I was just at the point where I could accept help. And so we went to a social service agency where they had psychologists and psychiatrists, social caseworkers, and I started peeling back the onion of my life. And over weeks and months, they really helped me. And I said, well, look at you. I mean, it's just fantastic. What are you doing now? And he said, well, I'm working at a big company here in Tucson, and I'm going to get married in 2 months. And I said, that's really unbelievable. So I went home that day to talk to my wife and tell the kids, what had happened. I was so happy for this young man. And it turned out that over the period of that discussion, I came to appreciate and realize that the woman who had helped him was my wife, and the young man was our son. And I think when we help people, it's a way we live our lives. We don't have to talk about it. We don't have to brag about it. We just have to do it. When we do it, the benefits to us are so great that it's the kind of thing we need to be doing all the time. So it was an important lesson for me to learn.
One of the finest stories I've ever heard, Warren, and I'm so glad you shared it again with everybody. And I'm going to stay on the same vein, Warren, for a minute. I'm going to keep pushing you here. You've been blessed. You've been helped by some pretty big people. First was your father, who shared his love of life, his poetry, his music, his background, which is magic. That's a leg up. The next guy who helped you was the President of the United States. I mean, he actually looked at you as a young kid and said, hey, and helped you. Can you think of any other stories of big bangs, I say, in Warren's life, the big bangs that are, wow, just points. It's hard to put you on the point like that, but you've had such an extraordinary life that I wondered, sharing those stories are so
that occurred that taught me an interesting lesson too, and it was one that was under pressure and under duress, and where there was a real threat of bodily harm. I was at the Los Angeles Boat Show with a business colleague of mine who I was looking to buy a boat and negotiating, and finally the doors were closing and they were forcing us out, and we started walking down the street. And the convention center in Los Angeles is on South Figueroa Street, one of the most difficult places in all of Los Angeles. There's a lot of gangs and drugs and violence that occur there. And of course, it was 10:30 at night, and we had to walk 6 blocks to a big parking lot. And our car was parked as far away in that parking lot as it could be. So my colleague and I were walking down the street, and we walked across an intersection, and there were about 5 or 6 young men in that doorwell of that intersection. And as we passed, I looked at them, and there was one man that stood out. He was a big, strong guy, probably 6'4", 5", 250 pounds. And his eyes met my eyes. And there's sometimes when we make eye contact with people, there's a recognition of something. There's a chemical reaction, a visceral reaction. There was in that case, and I just didn't know why, but we kept walking. And as we walked those 6 blocks, we became aware of the fact that there was someone walking behind us. And my business partner and I didn't address that or didn't talk about it. We just kept walking, heads down, trying to get to our car. And when we turned into that parking lot, we could see that our car, of course, was the furthest away, and probably 100 yards to walk to get to that car. And as we walked, the steps got ever closer. And as we continued across the parking lot, it was clear that those steps were right behind us. And our mind goes to a certain place. It's fight or flight. It's conscious response, unconscious response. It's all of those things. It sometimes occurs like great athletes have described in the moment of crisis in a game or a match where things slow down and you see things really clearly. And it was happening to me at that moment in time. That's called the vagus state. That's a controllable element, a teachable element of our mind, where we can get things to slow down and see things more clearly. And they were just becoming clear to me that we needed to do something or something was going to happen to us. And so I decided that I would do something unusual. And I just reached into my pocket, took out my wallet, pulled out all the cash that I had, which is about $500. And I just turned and faced the man. And I said, "Here, I think you need this more than I do." And he paused and just stopped. And you and I both know who it was. It was that 6'5", 250-pound guy that was in the doorwell. And he took the money. And he started to cry. And that's when I saw the knife in his hand. And he said, "I didn't want to hurt you." And I said, "I know that. Why don't you give me that?" And he gave me the knife. There's more to the story, but I think the notion is that we get prompted to do certain things at certain times in our lives. There are mystical forces that exist in the universe that influence us in unusual ways. We need to respond to that. When we feel a certain way, we need to respond to that. And almost always it's going to be positive. And so that was another moment in time that I was reminded that there are forces greater than us, greater than being an entrepreneur. And we need to pay attention to those forces. And when they speak to us, we really need to act on those intuitive feelings that we have. I think there are times where we simply need time and space to allow things to come to fruition and then act on that, right? And I think sometimes in our busy lives, particularly for entrepreneurs, we get so busy doing stuff that we don't call time out to listen carefully, to ask questions, to get information, and then take the time to let it sink in and then make choices and decisions. Oftentimes, as entrepreneurs, our decisions are rushed and ill-considered. And so time really creates the space that allows us to make good choices. And as an entrepreneur, we consistently have to make good choices to be successful.
But you also mentioned something really important, and that is we do make the decisions. You know, the way in which we make our decisions dramatically influences what the outcome can occur. So we are being impacted by forces around us, but we are also creating those at the same time. And I'd like to bring up something for you to comment on, Warren, that I've heard Peter say before. And what Peter has mentioned before is that, you know, when your values are clear, your decisions become easy, or at least easier. And I'd love to have you comment on that because, you know, part of the space that you're talking about right now, you create that space with your 10-10-10 routine in the morning. You think about the positive attributes of yesterday that were accomplished. the impact you had on those and what you saw because of it. And it really sets up the day to think about, how can I address this situation? I'm being followed. Bad things can happen, but they could be different depending on what my action is in that situation. Can you talk a little bit about the power of values in action and how it is that you think about the impact you have, not on a predetermined destination that you're out of control of, but the decisions that you're making every day and the impact that you can create from those decisions based on the values that you uphold?
Yeah, so I think the power of values is really important. And it, again, it's how we live our lives. It's how we model our lives. It's the journey that we're on, right? And it's how we all relate to each other in that journey. We tend to aggregate with people who have similar values and who believe similar things, right? People tend to find their groups. I think particularly in management, where you're bringing a disparate group together, each with brings their own personal background, their own set of values. It's important that we have clarity in a corporate or entrepreneurial setting of the values that drive our business, the values that we share together in the work environment that are going to allow us to be successful. In the companies that we've led, we make it pretty clear that if you breach those values, if you violate those values, you can't work in that environment anymore, right? It's just the values are so important. And each of us has to reflect those in our own corporate lives. We may have separate values outside of the corporation, outside of the corporate culture, but we need to adhere to those values and move along. And I think that's really important. And I think that's what President Ford was telling me when he turned and said, by being vulnerable, transparent, and honest, we share those values, and therefore I can trust you. And I think that's really important. And I've seen that in other settings as well, where we collaboratively and consensually design our values, create our values, make them prominent within the corporate setting, and then remind ourselves of those every day. In fact, in many of the companies that we've led, we have a vehicle and a mechanism whereby when we see someone living those values in a significant way, we have a way of calling that out and being certain that that's reinforced by those people who are there. So I think the values become really important, but in the end, the entrepreneurial leader is the one who sets the pace for those values and has to lead by example. And when we do that, we tend to get a more compliant environment around values that can drive us to greater success. And we've done about 250 acquisitions in our lifetime, and we often are going into companies and trying to discern what that company is all about and talking to people and so on. It only takes us a couple of hours to figure out what that corporate atmosphere and corporate culture and the value set is all about. We like to walk into businesses where you can't tell who the leader is. Doesn't have the biggest office, isn't issuing commandments and yelling and screaming, right? Isn't doing the kinds of stuff that some corporate leaders do, some entrepreneurs do, but that where leadership is distributed and diffused and where many people see themselves as leaders and they share in a value set that allows them to be successful together. And we found those to be the most interesting acquisitions to acquire. They require the least amount of disruption and difficulty once we integrate them into our own culture.
You just talked about being able to discern the culture within a couple of hours. A lot of that too is not just within the leaders, the way in which she or he carries themselves around the office and interaction with other individuals, but it's also the artifacts. I'd love to learn about some of the artifacts you have there in your office and the meaning that has for you. And then we'll get into the last question about some of the interesting things that you're excited about in the future here, Warren.
Many, many years ago when I was playing basketball, I had the opportunity to go to the home of Bill Russell, who was then leading the Boston Celtics, he was the 6-time MVP, greatest dynasty in NBA history, right? 11 championships in 13 years. And there were several of us there. And as I looked at his home, it was a very nice home. And we were getting ready to leave. And I said, Bill, one of the things that strikes me is that I don't see any evidence anywhere in your house that you ever played basketball. I've been in homes, and Tim, maybe you and Peter and Rita have been in homes that, where there are trophies and there are shrines and there are spotlights and there's all kinds of stuff, right? But there wasn't anything there. And he told me something really important. He said, I never want my children to compete with me. And I thought that was very interesting. meaning that the home is a special environment. I think the home and the office are special environments. So if you've come to our home, and Tim and Rita and Peter, you're all invited to our home. We'll hope you'll come to our home. And when you walk into our home, there are several things maybe that become obvious. Number one, there are really only two things on the walls, right? Artwork and family. Those are really the two things that we value, things of beauty and creativity and things that last forever, family. And so that's the two things. In my office, I have artwork and family. You also see over my my shoulder a picture of my wife and I. You see a picture of our family. But as to the artifacts, I think it sends signals about what's important in a person's life. We see offices also that are shrines to them, right? Plaques and trophies and pictures and all kinds of stuff. And that's just not something I want. So over the camera that I'm looking in right now is a magnificent painting called Sedona Morning. It's of Sedona, Arizona, with the sunlight coming across Oak Creek. It's just an amazing picture, right? And over my shoulder is a statue of a cowboy, head down, hat pulled down, rain slicker on, saddlebags over his arm, and he's walking into a storm. And the title is Weathering the Chores, meaning that no matter what the rain is, no matter what the struggle is, no matter what the difficulty is, you still got to get the chores done every day. And that's really the story of the entrepreneur. I touch that cowboy's hat every day when I come in here. I bought that after I went through a particularly difficult period in business where I went to work every day for 2 years thinking that was the day I'd file personal bankruptcy, fighting lawyers and bankers and insurance companies and all kinds of stuff. We ultimately prevailed, ultimately won. It was a 2-year battle. But every day I was weathering the chores. And so I found that statue and I love it. It's a bronze. And so I touch his head every day when I come in because I got chores to weather, right? I got to get after it. Regardless of the rain or the snow or the mud or the muck or the mire, you still got to get the job done every day.
What are you excited about that's on the horizon right now, Warren?
Oh, look, tomorrow's my best day, right? Next week's my best week. Next month's going to be the best acquisition I'm ever going to make. I just am absolutely feel strongly that optimism and positivity drive entrepreneurs. And I'm an entrepreneur from very beginning. My dad was an entrepreneur. My grandfather was an entrepreneur. And so maybe that's genetic, maybe it's not. But this whole notion of being positive about things, about not getting mired down in the muck. Are we in the middle of a pandemic? Absolutely. Do we have civil unrest in this country? Absolutely. Are there solutions to those? Yeah, there are. Let's go find the solutions. Let's work hard at it. Let's contribute to it. Let's do everything we can to make this world successful and better. But let's take control of it and do it in a healthy, positive way. Now, Peter and Rita are that way. I love them for that. I'm sure, Tim, you're the same way. I think it's this notion of let's look forward, right, not backward. I think too many people get trapped in their past, looking at their past, maybe failures, maybe things that weren't quite as successful, brings them down a little bit. I just think we learn from our past experiences and we take those lessons and then we close the door on that experience. And then we use those lessons to propel us forward. And so we don't get drugged down by the past. We don't get too euphoric about the past. We've all had successes and failures back there somewhere, but that's not about tomorrow. That's not about current state. Tomorrow's going to be terrific. I can't wait to get there. It's going to be a lot of fun. When the sun rises in Arizona, it's always magnificent and beautiful. I can't wait to get up, do my 10, 10, and 10 routine, and then get out the door and do fun things. And I think that's what entrepreneurship is all about.
I knew this was going to be a fantastic masterclass, and you didn't let us down. It was an amazing hour, Warren, spent with a master. And I want to thank you so much for your commitment to the entrepreneurs. I know that everybody learning and listening today to what you have to say, their lives are going to be enriched very much for that. So thank you, my friend. I really appreciate it, Warren. You did us an honor today. My appreciation.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you and Rita for your wonderful leadership and all things that you do. It's fantastic. I love your attitude. I love the way you look at things. It's fantastic. Tim, thanks for the good questions. They were excellent, made me think, put me hard to the road here, so it worked out great. And a person we haven't thanked is Alicia, who did the technical stuff and did such a great job. So Alicia, thank you very much. But thanks so much for allowing me to be a part of this program. And I hope that you and Rita have just a wonderful life and things continue to go great for you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Warren. That was awesome.
Thank you, Warren. Bye-bye for now.